Hey, Wayne Fox, and a question I get asked frequently by students is which is the best sequence or order to make my adjustments while I'm in the basic panel and working on an image. There's a fairly short answer to that, which I'll get into in a minute, but one thing that has changed in the last few years is the addition of the white and black sliders and the change in the thought process of setting our white and black point when we're working on an image. And so this video kind of talks about what we used to do and what changed because of 2012. And it will really show that the only times you use those sliders are when you're finished with the image or sometimes right when you start with an image. But most of the time, you don't really need to do anything with those sliders except for those two times. So let's take a look at a few of the reasons why. So let's take a look at this image first. This is in the 2010 process. And you'll notice if I hit my J key to show highlight clipping, that immediately Lightroom shows that I have both quite a bit of highlight and shadow clipping. And so typically our workflow in the past, and this has been the case for 20 years, even back in Photoshop days well before Lightroom, is we would try to adjust our highlight and shadow clipping to fall within our histogram. So in this case we might use a little bit of exposure, and we might use a little bit of recovery, and we'd pull that out. And then we might bring our blacks up, our blacks down, and pull that out, and then maybe fill light to bring them in. Now you notice how my fill light is really not raising my shadows, it's raising my midtones almost as much. And this is a big difference in how the new process 2012 works. So let's go back to the image in the 2010 process, and here again we see the clipping. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to change from the 2010 to the 2012 process. And if you'll notice as I go back and forth between those two, that the 2012 process seems to lose a tiny bit of contrast. I'm not sure how well you can see that, but notice the detail come up in the rocks, and notice the highlights smooth out in this region. Let's go back and do that again, but let's do it with the clipping indicators on. And this is the real difference. As soon as I move to the 2012 process, you'll see that all of my clipping is gone. So Lightroom has already tried to pick an optimum tonal range, and it's moved my clipping within the range of my histogram. So here's another image that pushes the dynamic range quite a bit, and you'll notice how underexposed most of it looks so that I can prevent clipping here in the actual sun. And in fact, it doesn't look like there's much clipping here. But here again, we're in the 2010 process, and if we hit our J key to show clipping, we see a considerable amount. I'm going to zoom in here on the highlight clipping, and as I move around in this, take a look at the histogram. Even though this says it's clipped here, you'll notice that only one channel is clipped. And in the blue channel, I'm at 75–80%. So there's a lot of color data up here, and Lightroom is pretty good about reconstructing data if there's one or two channels of information. And in fact, if I hide that clipping indicator, you'll notice that I have some color detail and some imagery here, and only in this area am I completely blown to white. Let's zoom back out and turn clipping back on. And now we're going to move to the 2012 process, and again you'll see that most of the clipping now is gone. And all of that area which had detail before, is able to pull it down. And if I zoom in here, you'll notice that most of this, none of the channels are clipped, only this very, very bright part of the sun. Let's go back one more time without the clipping indicator, and notice again how we seem to lose a tiny bit of contrast. And that's simply because what Lightroom is trying to do is squeeze those white and black points in so the dynamic range fits within the histogram. Something we used to have to do when we started, and now it's pretty much doing that for us. So one other demonstration that kind of indicates why maybe using the white and black point should wait until the last step most of the time, I can show with this rather synthetic image here. If I again hit J to turn the clipping indicators on, and I try to get rid of highlight clipping by moving my white point all the way to the left, you'll notice that I can't eliminate white clipping by using just the white point. So if I would have done that to start with, it wouldn't have done me a lot of good. However, notice how quickly I can get rid of white clipping by using either the exposure slider, and of course that affects the overall tonal value of the image, or by using the highlight slider, which affects the rest of the image very little. In fact, let's just go back, let's turn clipping off and go back and forth. This is before the highlight was adjusted, and this is after, and you'll see that the image itself is barely changing, and yet I was able to dial that out. So it doesn't make a lot of sense to tweak your white and black point when your other adjustments are going to have an impact on those. And that's why I never adjust my white and black point anymore on most images until I'm finished with all of the other processes. As far as slider order, it's been said, and I believe it was a video or tutorial I saw from Jeff Shuey, as well as some others, that the concept is the sliders are in the sequence that best matches the process of working on an image. So in that logic, you would do exposure, then you would do contrast, then you would do highlights, blah, blah, blah. And you notice it is significant that white and black are the final steps. I am of the opinion that you really have to do that on an image by image basis. And I adjust what the image needs first. Obviously, that makes a little bit of sense. I mean, if I don't need to adjust exposure, then obviously I would move to the next step. But I find myself most of the time just kind of grabbing sliders and playing with them on what I think the image needs. As I mentioned, the order of making the adjustments has no bearing on the final output of the image. All that matters is what the final numbers end up, and then Lightroom will take those numbers, and that's all of the metadata numbers, the final state, and then it will generate the final image based on that. And the order it applies those adjustments is based on internal logic, not by the sequence that you made the steps in. So the idea of adjusting white and black pretty much as your final step instead of your first step, there are exceptions to that. And most of the time, if I have an image where my dynamic range falls well short of the full possible range in the histogram, then the first step I'm going to do is to adjust my white and black clipping to try to decide what the final dynamic range that I want the image to be in. This is a pretty good example of that. This was a pretty foggy morning when I shot that, but this image makes it look much foggier than it was, and it mutes the colors far more than they were when I was there. And that's typical of shooting in the fog sometimes. And a lot of times that's what we want, but in this case, that's not what I wanted. So if I were working on this image, I would, let me go here to my crop rectangle, I would adjust my white and my black points as a starting. Now, one tip I have on that, and a little shortcut that isn't too well known, if you're trying to automatically extend your white and black clipping to the edge of the histogram, you can hold the shift key down and double click the label, so white, then black. And you'll notice what that did to the histogram is it extended the dynamic range to fill the entire histogram automatically. Now, in this particular case, this is probably more dynamic range than I want, and there'd be a lot of other things I need to do. I'm going to make a couple of quick adjustments here. I don't like how this corner seems different than the rest of the image, so I'm going to do a little graduated filter. I'm going to pull the contrast way down and the exposure up a little bit, so it sort of evens that out just a little bit. It looks a little bit more like the rest of the image. And now once I've done that, I will then make my final white and black points. I don't want my blacks, I don't want any black in the image at all, so I'm actually going to pull it up a little bit. And I don't want any real whites in the image, so I'm going to pull my whites down a little bit. So I've still limited my dynamic range to less than the full potential, but it's about the range that I'm going to want in the final image. So here I have adjusted those points to start. And when I'm done with the image, I might have to tweak those white and black points. But that's the exception of when I use white and black first now. And that's about the only time I use white and black as the first step of processing an image. So to finish, I thought I would just show before and afters of the images I used in the demo. Sometimes that's helpful so people kind of get an idea of what others do on their work. This is the first image I showed, and this was the raw state basically, and this is what I ended up with. All of the work was done in Lightroom using either adjustment brushes, graduated filters, and I've got about 5 versions of this image, and I think I like this one the best, and I maybe still don't have it exactly where I want it. This is the next image I used, and after a little work in Lightroom, I was able to pull up the reflections of that water. This is much more like what I actually saw when I was there. Certainly that water wasn't dark like the camera saw it. And last was the fog shot that I did in Colorado, and I'm pretty happy with what I ended up with in the final image on this one. I think it captures the mood of the morning. So anyway, that's kind of my take on slider order, especially the concept of when to set the white and black point and how that's different now than it was even a few years ago. Hopefully that was helpful, and I'll see you next time.